Oh, cool. Okay. And are you able, so you would, oh, but they can't see you. Or should I share my screen? No, I don't think so. No, you just share yours. Yeah. So it's sharing, right? To everyone. Yeah. 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 Okay. All right, so we are on. So this is the webinar with Immigrants Rising. We are doing this as a part of Undocu Week for community colleges across California in support of undocumented college students. So we're going to be taking the next hour or so to kind of discussing more of mental health related factors that are related with immigration policy, given the current political context, and really kind of getting into some of the recommendations that we feel are important in this time frame, and just offering a space of just community advocacy, community support, and kind of thinking about the wellness of the community. So we'll just go ahead and dive into the PowerPoint and then get into some introductions. Yeah? Okay. Okay, so like we said, this is the title of this webinar is addressing the mental health needs of undocumented, documented college students. We also know that in terms of identification, right, students identify across the spectrum. So we wanted to, just kind of put that out there and be sensitive to that, and really kind of highlight that as a framework as we kind of move into the webinar. Okay. So this is just a little just reminder of all the amazing events that have been taking place. Today we're going to be prioritizing mental health, and tomorrow we'll be focused on arts and advocacy. Great. So just as an introduction or as an agenda, we wanted to just share and kind of just be transparent in terms of kind of the focus for today for this webinar, and kind of just go through some introductions so you know who is talking, why we do this work, really where it's grounded from, kind of go briefly into some learning goals so that everybody's kind of on the same page. Again, this is a topic that can be very broad. We only have an hour, so we want to kind of make sure that we speak to things that we can go in depth about, and also recognize that it's a really broad topic. Some of the content areas that we thought would be helpful in covering today are kind of going through just a 101 of what is fear. I think in the current political context, particularly when we're talking about undocumented communities, we often talk about fear. That has been sort of a driven sort of topic as well. So we wanted to make sure that we have some time to cover that and kind of think through what it means in terms of physiological aspects, psychological aspects, and behavioral sort of manifestations in which fear can kind of show up in. We'll kind of tie and weave that into obviously our community, and kind of go into some coping mechanisms, and kind of talk about allyship, the importance of allyship, and share some resources that I think would be helpful for us to kind of just be aware of. We are getting the hang of this webinar situation, and I think my fingers are a little too, yeah, it does. Also, we are aware that we'll be getting maybe some questions throughout the presentation. So we definitely want to welcome you and encourage you. If at any point any questions come up for you, feel free to, share those questions with us. I think that that's ultimately what's going to make this conversation, this dialogue and presentation more fruitful and useful and effective in understanding what we're talking about. And I think also, I know that part of this effort is to encourage allyship, is to encourage community. So we know that there might be some viewing community gatherings happening with educators and faculty and administrators with undocumented students with our community who's impacted by this. So we want to thank you for joining, and we want to encourage you to participate as much as you'd like. That being said, we'll start with some formal brief introductions, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Samudio, who is a mentor and a co-chair of the California Psychological Association and the Immigrant Task Force. She has done a lot of work with our community. She obtained her doctorate degree in clinical psychology within the social justice track. So a lot of her work is really grounded in that feeling of social justice. Her dissertation was focused on exploring the mental health of undocumented Latinx college students. And she completed her internship and postdoc at UC Davis, specializing in working with AB 540 and undocumented students. So it is a gift. It is a pleasure to have Dr. Samudio with us today. She brings in a lot of expertise. So I'm going to turn it over to her in case she wants to share a little bit more about that, and then we can continue.
Lily, thank you for having me. I think I look to you for inspiration and for just guidance. I think you've done a lot of work in this area, and I think I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me. You know, this cheesy picture I have up right now, I'm pretty excited about that. You know, I got to share the voice for the community when I was at Davis, and so I think a lot of this work is really sharing the knowledge and sharing how we can help each other, especially in mental health.
Absolutely. Great. Wonderful. Apparently I don't want to show mine.
Yeah. So it's my pleasure to introduce Lily Campos. Lily, you're getting your doctorate degree from USF, University of San Francisco. You're currently, your practicum is at the hospital at UCSF in the pediatrics unit. That's really awesome work. You work with a team of folks to kind of assess folks for where they're at in mental health and the things that they need. You're also a part of the Immigration Task Force Committee. We're so lucky to have you. And you were the Support and Career Service Manager at Immigrants Rising in 2013 to 2014. So you've been with this organization for a very long time. What I'm excited about today is learning more about your dissertation on the mental health outcomes of fear of deportation and fear of detainment among undocumented college students. I mean, since the Donald Trump presidency, I think we're experiencing a lot of that right now, a lot of fear. And, these are some of the invisible stressors that I think folks are feeling, that it's, we're not able to understand what's happening in our bodies, in our mind, in our spirit. And so I think shedding light on that would be awesome. And then finally, you can get in touch with Lily. It's her email down there. I mean, if you want to see someone's spirit really come through, I think your picture on there was awesome. I'm like, dang,
angry Lily.
No, that's passionate there. That's speaking your voice.
Yeah, and I think, if I could actually kind of bring it around in terms of kind of, again, the purpose of this presentation and a lot of why we do this work, why I do this work is really, it's really grounded in community organizing and activism. Like you mentioned, I started with Immigrants Rising, formerly known as Educators for Fair Consideration, and I think that that's what's so powerful about Immigrants Rising is that a lot of the work really comes from within the community, for the community. I was undocumented for a very long time until about a couple of years ago. So a lot of this is very personally driven. It really comes from my heart. It really comes from a lot of personal experiences and understanding and kind of thinking through a lot about how immigration policy really does impact our well-being, right? And kind of thinking through our wellness and our resilience, despite, you know, all the stressors that are happening around us constantly. And so really fear being a key component here, and really kind of from the context of liberation psychology, which looks at the wellness of oppressed communities, the wellness in which a lot of the times, because we don't have the language in which oppression, racism, violence, and discrimination impacts our health, right? We might feel a certain way. And so really kind of tying these two together is part of how I think we not only break some of the stigma that comes with mental health in general, but also in kind of thinking about ourselves as as undocumented immigrants in the context of our well-being and our resilience and the resistance that is needed in order to fight back, to resist, but to also live our lives. So that's my spiel. So finally, again, I already mentioned sort of the frame in which we're going to be kind of referencing. So really kind of touching a little bit from a trauma-informed lens embedded within liberation psychology to describe some of the stressors that may be experienced by undocumented college students as a result of immigration policies that increase or exacerbate feelings of uncertainty, stress, anxiety, and depression. So kind of thinking about those. Specifically, we want to offer some recommendations for continued advocacy to support the wellness and educational pursuits of undocumented college students. We know that there is a fine relationship between wellness and education, so we kind of want to hone in on that as well. And really kind of think about our role as, you know, whether we're students, undocumented students who are directly impacted by what's happening, what's our role as administrators, faculty, and mental health clinicians, and being able to create safe spaces where undocumented college students can exist, be themselves, explore their many different identities, and really the power of developing allyship through this work.
So the learning objectives today is we're going to discuss, you know, the wellness of undocumented college students. You know, like Lily said, stressors related to fear, distress, depression, anxiety. You know, and like the normal stuff like college students go through. You know, when you're in college, I think those certainly play a role in it. We're also going to explore ways to support the wellness of undocumented students through the perspectives of administrators, staff, faculty. I know a lot of folks like want to help students and they're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help. What do they need? How do I know if they need it? Will folks come up and tell me? And so I feel like just creating more space to see how we can build allyship, creating spaces, I think we'll touch on today. And finally, we're gonna explore some coping strategies. We need some of that right now.
Yes. Great. I can't seem to get this. Okay. I'm just gonna,
Yes.
Okay. So like we mentioned, we're gonna be talking about fear and what that means. There's definitely been a lot of talk in terms of the increase in fear since Donald Trump took office. The many already existing policies, anti-immigration policies that really induce and increase levels of fear in our communities and amongst those who are directly impacted by these policies. So I thought it would be helpful for us to kind of think through what fear is, right, as an emotion, as a physiological response. So fear is really intended to be activated for survival purposes. It's a system in our bodies that is natural, that exists in many of us, and that really the purpose of it is for it to activate sort of like an alarm in our bodies that says, look, something's not happening right? There's a dangerous situation happening. Maybe there's a dangerous event happening. And so you need to kind of step into a survival sort of response. it's intended to address immediate and short-term danger. And I think that that's really important for us to kind of think about, right? It's a system, yes, it's built into our bodies, into our biology, but it's really meant for it to be short-term. Our bodies can't be at a high state of arousal forever, right? We'll get into that a little bit more when that is the case. Again, fear is activated by a system called the autonomic nervous system, right? Which includes two subsystems, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic system. The sympathetic system is what we might think of, or what we might talk about as the fight or flight and freeze response. A lot of the times the freeze response gets kind of forgotten, but that's really important. So to kind of even just kind of, you know, bring it down a little bit more behaviorally in terms of what the fight or flight freeze response might be, right? Fight might be, you know, somebody who is under severe stress, if you will, and they might react sort of in a way that is more physical, right? The flight might be, you know, somebody just not wanting to be in that space, right? Wanting to get away from it as much as possible. And then the freeze response, which might happen where we're so activated that our body literally freezes, right? And so these responses are very appropriate when situations are dangerous. So you'll see here that I put a picture of a lion, right? And so in a given situation where we were, let's say we were here and we saw a lion, right? One of our fight or flight or freeze responses would be activated, right? And we would want that to happen because we need to seek out survival, right? So again, right, that alarm is supposed to go off in our bodies for us to be able to survive that situation. That means that our prefrontal cortex right over here, which actually enables us to stop and think and make a more thoughtful response, is not going to be activated. That's not supposed to happen, right? There's no time for Dr. Some of you and I to sit here and think about, like, what do we do? Should we, like, think of this strategy or that strategy? That's not going to happen, right? Our bodies are not meant to do that. So you can imagine that when somebody's, you know, sympathetic nervous system has kicked in, right, they might respond really immediately, right? It's a reaction. When we think about the bigger context of immigration, when we think about our communities, when we think about rates, when we think about the fear of detention, the fear of deportation, right? You can imagine how this sympathetic nervous system is being continuously and repeatedly activated, right? Remember what I said earlier, right? Our bodies are not meant to be at a high arousal state. I think we're back on. I think we're good. I apologize. So yes, so that's the parasympathetic system. It takes about, after a dangerous situation happens, right? We know that there are varying levels of situations that could happen that might impact the way somebody reacts. It takes about 30 minutes for this parasympathetic system to activate and help us actually think through, where are we? What do we do next? Okay. This next slide, I think, is really, really important for us to kind of think about as we, again, talk about fear, as we talk about depression and anxiety. I think what is really important, at least for me, as I kind of think through the many experiences that many of my community members, family, friends experience when, we hear that, DACA is being, is under threat, when we hear of a community, raid, of an ICE raid in the community, when we hear of somebody get deported, right? I think there is a certain level of stress that the community experiences, right? And so I think that it's important to think about how illegality is a social condition, right? That is intended to reinforce oppression. It's intended to reinforce uncertainty and hopelessness and stress in our bodies. And so when we start thinking about illegality as sort of this social construct and social determinant of health, if you will, it takes away also, I think, from this feeling of there's something wrong with me, right? When we start thinking and talking about what is going on in our communities from that perspective, I think as administrators, as faculty, as mental health providers, as undocumented students, I think we can really start to understand how undocumented legal status is a stressor. It impacts our health, right? So yes, immigration policy is very connected to health. Immigration policy is connected to education. Education is connected to health, right? So it's almost this triangular, right, and continuous cycle, right, that if one of them is meant to oppress, right, then the rest are impacted in a way.
For sure. I think when you talk about, the legality and what is meant to do, it's really oppressing people existence, I think, and for someone to internalize those messages, I think really is a detriment when you're trying to, focus in passing a test and studying, in doing homework, and just going through the normal activities of college students. I think that's looming in someone's head. Someone asked me, Esma, what's the difference between a first generation a college student and someone who identifies as documented and undocumented student? And I was like, well, the fear of deportation that's forever looming over someone's head. And it's one of those external stressors that pathologize on people's mental health. It's really what we're experiencing, the fear you're experiencing, is this response to these laws.
Right. And I think also, with pathology, right, which might reinforce stigma, right? I think that could be a barrier to somebody seeking out support that I think is very appropriate, right? If we're experiencing a high level of fear, it makes sense that we wouldn't be able to concentrate or complete our work or want to go out into the community, right? We want to make sure that people are able to live their lives despite the chaos that is happening. We want to validate sort of the experience of the fear, right? Because we know that that's real. We can't say, no, it doesn't exist. And yet at the same time, we want to, through this conversation, even through thinking about sort of illegality as a social construct, empower ourselves as a community, whether we're impacted or not, to explore these different ways of coping and understanding what's happening in our bodies. So like you mentioned, I think some of the stressors that might be expressed might be related, are related to, awareness and deportation of others, of ourselves or in the community, awareness of uncertainty about the future, right? So kind of thinking through the many different, policies that, just the up and down that is happening, right? with mixed status families, I think it's also important to kind of think about the many differences in which perhaps somebody who's more versed in immigration policy, or someone who is engaging in community organizing, right, around this, might experience the situation differently versus a family member or a friend who maybe is not, right? And so that doesn't mean that the levels are like any more or any less, but that being, knowing your rights, exactly, that's what I'm trying to say. Knowing your rights is a way of building that self-empowerment, is a way of building our consciousness about what is right and what is not, and also kind of thinking about sort of this constant sort of threat.
Yeah, and I also want to say, like, sometimes, like, all these things are happening. I think that's why we're having this conversation, because in mental health, we're bringing up mental health to the forefront. Sometimes a lot of these stressors are in the background. They're of our minds. They're like it's like you have those browsers open in the back of your head, and while you're focusing on your grades, on working, checking in with family. So yeah, a lot of these stressors may be running in the background.
Right, exactly. And again, if we even kind of think about the fear, the fear response, right? Our bodies might be so activated, right, that these things that require a lot of thinking, a lot of planning, a lot of strategizing, right, might be in the back of our minds, in the back of our heads, right, because we're so focused on just surviving in that moment. Next one. All right.
Oh, no, yeah. Sorry.
Did I go through the last one? Sorry, we're doing some checking.
We just did this
one. Okay, we just did that.
Yeah, and then
we're here. This one right here.
Yes.
I think that's you.
Yeah. So yeah, like we mentioned, criminalizing folks, dehumanizing people, treating them as objects is really, I think, what's on the agenda right now in terms of politics. And these policies, like, I think sometimes I want to stop watching TV. I want to stop watching, like, looking at my Facebook or my social media. There's just a lot of things happening right now where, it seems like the administration is coming out with something new every day, and it's really in provoking fear amongst a lot of folks. People are, like, hyper aware of their surroundings. They're policing themselves. They're making sure, like, what their actions are not breaking some sort of law or something. It really is taking, like, a toll on folks' sense of hope. And some people are, trying to avoid the whole, the detainment and just deporting themselves. Like, you know what, let me not get my family in this situation. Let me say bye. Let me just go and so to save my family some grief. It's a lot of what's happening right now in the news.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah, and I think exactly what you mentioned, right? These are some of the effects that could happen, right, from immigration policies. And again, right, when we think about undocumented legal status as a social condition, right, that is tied to obviously immigration policies that are not supporting the wellness, right, and the growth of immigrant and documented populations, right. Anti-immigration policies can affect and impact, right, this self-policing, right, hopelessness and self-deportation.
Yeah, like we mentioned, like, a lot of students, it's their first generation students, and and they're the first in their families. They're going to community college. They're going to college. It's a big deal. It's their first time. And navigating the systems is new. There isn't maybe somebody, a cousin or a sibling that went to college before them, or they may have had a different status than them. And so asking for help, like, okay, what's the right paperwork to fill out, especially when it comes in terms of financial aid. There's things that you have to kind of out yourself in a way to receive these services. But for sure, like, you know, I had one student share, like, you know, they went to the financial aid office, they didn't know which papers to ask for, you know, was on the phone with mom, and the financial aid person said, oh, you know, we don't have what you're looking for. And she was like very distressed about it because the semester was starting, and then was asking mom didn't know how to help. And they just kind of both cried on the phone. But I think, you know, as these centers for undocumented students are coming up, I think that's helping in a way of like getting to know what to ask for. And you know, some of these students, they may go off to college, but they're still like working like a full-time job, part-time job. They may be going full-time to school or part-time to school. They're still you know, they have to, you know, maintain themselves, but mostly they contribute to the family income. And so those roles for them, they don't end. They continue. And sometimes if a parent has a seasonal job, you know, a student may have to, like, you know, contribute more, or, you know, so there's definitely financial demands. I think community college right now is a way of folks like entering the education system in terms of college, and then transferring to a 4-year or UC. So in my dissertation, I know it was one of the primary stressors for students, just the financial demands. Also, like, making the decision to, like, be away from home. Sometimes students leave, you know, they want the college experience, they want to be independent. And it's leaving the family, or the, you know, the family is a primary source for a lot of undocumented students. I mean, there's this really special bond, this really sacred bond. And when someone leaves a family, it's kind of, you're taking a risk. And it could be stressful for everyone. And sometimes families may be like, you know, why are you leaving? Don't you like it here anymore? And so there's a whole like dance and conversation that goes around leaving at home. Also, and I put also staying home. Sometimes, like, you know, you're in your role in your family, and that niche for focusing on your studies isn't always there, because maybe family doesn't know what you need to, like, be able to, like, finish your work. And so that that could be a stressor too. I remember when I first went to college, I'm also a first generation student. It's a culture shock. It's like, whoa, like, everybody has, like, freedom, like, like, you get to make your own decisions. I've never had so much responsibility. And, you know, I think asking a teacher for help was, like, very daunting. I didn't know if they were going to understand where I was coming from. I didn't know if they were going to say, like, you know, you should have known this from high school already. And then, like, making friends, building networks, having social support outside the family, I think is very new for a lot of people. And sometimes that trust that goes into building a relationship with a friend or a significant other is, you know, you're always wanting to protect that. And, you know, a person may feel like they don't know you completely because you're always, like, a little bit guarded. But you know, that comes with adjusting to a new environment. So some of these stressors are very, very normal for college students, and then plus the layers that we're talking about, the fear and the uncertainty. So yeah, I just want to make sure that we touch on those.
Yeah, and I think, you know, oftentimes I think when we think about undocumented college students, I mean, I went to college a long time ago. And this was pre-DACA. This was like pre even having the word undocumented. And so things were a little bit different back then. But I think when we think about disclosure, right, when somebody is disclosing that they are undocumented, whether it's because they're doing it in the context of obtaining or wanting or needing to obtain resources such as financial aid, and or because they really are trying to build this allyship and trust with people, I think it's really important to kind of think about those different ways in which it happens and try to mediate, alleviate, and decrease as much stress as that could be possible.
Something that just came up for me, a lot of times there's this narrative of the good student or the good immigrant that everyone's like a 4.0, like 4.0 plus student, and you go to college and you want to continue being that 4.0 student, and so it's where not everyone's a 4.0 student, right? We're all like we all have different GPAs. We go to school for different reasons. So I just want to make sure we say that. I think living up to that narrative is not realistic.
I think that goes back into, again, immigration policy and the ways in which I think immigrants and documented immigrants are thought of as merit, right? Like the only way that you are worthy of immigration protection, right, is if you, right? And so I think that it's important to know the historical context in which these narratives also get constructed, right? And the pressures that exist in having to meet those demands, because we also know that a lot of scholarships are kind of set up in that way. So I think that it's important to kind of think about that. We have some questions. So do we want to answer some of those questions really quickly?
Questions. They're asking about what are some culturally responsive techniques for supporting undocumented students' emotional health, and sometimes students have shared that they don't get services within the institution because staff doesn't look like them or speak their language, and they're wondering, how can they bring us up intentionally?
Yeah, absolutely. And those are really valid questions that I think we sit with and kind of think through a lot. So we definitely want to offer those and make sure that we cover those. We do have some of those. So maybe what we can do is kind of see if we can move on to some of the coping. Because I think we already kind of covered the previous slides.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of times when we're talking about these, like the landscape of how things are right now, it brings up a lot of uncomfort for folks, and we quickly want to move into like, what can we do? I experience it all the time. So yeah, there's some things that students can do and some things like educators can do. Right now, I'm just going to look at coping for what students can do. So students, like, like we said, like some of these stressors are invisible. So it's not like you're feeling some kind of way, you're not sure why, and you want, maybe some examples, maybe like you want to cry, maybe like out of nowhere, maybe your body feels tense, maybe you don't know how your body feels, like you're not paying attention, maybe you're like sleeping a little bit more than usual, eating a little bit more than usual or less than usual. Folks are letting you know, like, hey, I noticed you lost some weight, and you're like very unintentional about that. I think are some like red flags for folks to address and know about themselves. I think folks know themselves a lot better and can tell when you're not doing so well. And I want to let folks know too that in our field of psychology, there is literature saying that racism, discrimination, xenophobia do impact mental health. So this isn't something that we're just saying because just the same. There's literature on this, there's science, there's behind this, there's evidence. So we want to make sure that that you all know this. Some of the coping skills, I think I've learned from you know, I want to say Western psychology, but also from my background being identifying as Latinx, my parents immigrated over from Mexico, was really like rooting ourselves in the collective value of our families. Like, how do we problem solve in our family? How do we get through tough times? How can we remember our culture, our traditions? And I mention this because family and culture tend to really be high protective factors for mental health, especially when talking about like suicidal ideation and intent. I think just going back to your roots is a good way. If you have a spiritual practice, you know, practice, I think. There's a lot of there's in the Bay Area. I think there's a lot of opportunities for that, and so it's in the individual strengths and also collectively, and that could be with your family or with your friends that also, you know, can identify as being in the same situation. I know of students that were like, Esme, you know, I live with these other students, but they don't share my status, and so I don't feel like I can talk freely about what's going on. And so they don't share. This one right here, this point on remember who you are, I think a lot of the legalities and a lot of the fear make people forget like who they are, because who they are, like, nobody's gonna ever take away from them. That's something that they take with them wherever they go. So remember why you're in college. Remember why you're on this path. Remember like your desires and your passion and just who you are, really. I think it's a way to remember ourselves.
And I think what kind of comes up for me as I hear you kind of talk about this is really this also, the undocumented, unafraid, and apologetic sort of like practice, right? That is really, I think, kind of hones in on that sort of this feeling of like, that's my status, and yes, I face struggles and difficulties because of the status, and yes, we need to advocate and move to address that, but that doesn't define who I am, right? It doesn't define like my aspirations, my hard work, who I am as a human being. And I think that when, and I know it's, you know, it sits heavy in my heart to even say that, right? That we have to have a discussion about our like humanity, but that is the reality that of many of us that experience the discrimination, oppression that is infused by our anti-immigration policies, Donald Trump. But that when we remember who we are daily, right? Even just having like a daily sort of like practice around that. What does that look like for you? Very silly for me, it's like literally having water, like making sure that like my body is nourished in that way. Like if I'm not drinking enough water, you know, what is happening, right? So I think it's finding these like really small but very valuable and very big ways of kind of understanding our bodies and our spirit.
Yeah, I think when I sit for a long period of time and like my body's like, I don't want to sit anymore, and I become really irritable, I'm like, oh, I need some sun. Or a massage or something. Some chamomile tea, de manzanilla. But yeah, like remember to dance, jog, write, sing. I remember a student saying like, if I'm not singing, that means like I'm not okay. Laugh, hike, because when you forget to do these things or when you're not being yourself, something's wrong.
Right. Yeah. The beautiful thing about this, right, when we dance, we jog, we sing, we engage in activities that make us happy, we are actually producing a happy juice in our brain called serotonin, right, and dopamine. And these juices in our brain, right, neurotransmitters, help us combat that very activated fear response or stress response, right? And it's just natural medicine, natural healing things that are going into our body that are making us feel better and really so important to engage in some type of activity that makes us feel happy. Do we have any questions that we want to stop and think about?
Well, just really quickly for the language, bring it up in your staff meetings with, when you have meetings, share, students are saying, there isn't paperwork that's in their language that they can understand, or also that parents can understand too. And so, yeah, make sure you bring that up in meetings. So I want to make sure I just touched on that. And then there's a question about, there's an educator who provides, I work providing college access for high school seniors. And a lot of my undocumented students have very valid fears about disclosing their status in college applications. But I fill it out, the California Dream Act. How do you validate these fears students are experiencing?
Yeah. How do we validate these fears in a way where, we're validating the experience, right, of the young person. We certainly don't want to take away from that, because that's what they're experiencing, and it's important to do it. But how do we do it also in a way where we're incorporating and building this language of hope, right?
One response I have to that is maybe like if there's like a group of college students that are like maybe freshman, sophomore, or senior even, if like in terms of like mentorship, maybe like students who have gone through the process can share with the high school senior, this is how I did it, this is what went on for me. But sometimes I feel like we may have to carry the responsibility of carrying students, and in part, yes, but also connect them to a network of folks.
Yeah, and I would say that with that, I mean, I think that as educators, as allies, we ourselves might be impacted by these policies, right? Our families might be impacted, our communities, right? Like, we're talking about this from a community perspective, that this is where we get to tie in our activism and our allyship, right? Whether it's one-on-one talking with somebody and really validating their experience and co-creating a safe space where this young person, college student, can talk about their narrative. Because every time we share our narrative, it changes. And those changes also change us. But we want to make sure that it's in an empowering way, right? In a healing way. And so when we create these safe spaces, right, where we can tell our stories, where we can talk about our fears in a way where it's not stigmatizing, right, that is powerful. So even if we take it into the classroom, right? What does your syllabus look like? Is there language in your syllabus that like is not inclusive of undocumented students, right? Of the status and the experiences that undocumented college students might have. When the topic of immigration comes up, right? How do you manage that? What are some things that you have found helpful in creating a safe space when people can share? But also being mindful of potential microaggressions that might come up. Okay, I'm gonna let you.
Resilience. I was trying to come up with a definition of resilience, and I think I'm more of a visual person, and I think a picture says a lot of words. And so I was thinking about these trees, that are bending over backwards, that are, or maybe forward or sideways, but they're bending. And you think like, oh my God, maybe this tree is in distress. But they're still rooted, they're still grounded. And when you think of like, what is holding up this tree? Those must be some deep roots to keep holding that tree up and keeping it healthy. But as you see like multiple trees there, kind of bending over, they're not breaking. Notice they're not breaking. They're still like reaching towards the sun. And it looks like even there's a path that's being created. And I think, we sometimes it feels like we have to like bend in and twist in very uncomfortable ways. And yet I think it's, we're not breaking. I think there's a community of folks out there that are supporting students, are supporting educators. There's more and more trainings every day about how to address mental health for students. And it's just, you know, you're not alone. And there's folks out there that want to help.
Yeah, I think what I hear is adaptability, right? Which I think kind of speaks to our community and the resilience, right? That we are adapting every day to an environment that creates toxic stress. But that because of our adaptability, we've also created communities, right? And engaging in this discussion about mental health, I think, you know, it's so important, and you know, the fact that a lot of people are engaging, I think, speaks volumes of the need in our community, but also how we normalize our experience. I should. Oh, no, community. You try.
I think it's one. When we talk about liberation psychology, I think about Marisa Montero. She's one of the leading experts in this field of liberation psychology. Comes from a country, I think in Argentina. She's at a university in Argentina. And when I think of like where psychology comes from, it's pretty Western, very European. And where liberation psychology comes from is like more from the Latin Americas. I do realize immigration is not just a Latinx issue. It's impacts very many communities, and so, and I think a lot of communities that are collective in their being, and so I want to make sure that we talk about a lot of self-care, but I also want to incorporate a collective way of well-being, and so for sure there's the self-care and the personal needs, you know, creating, like, having some hope and optimism, also that, you know, what you're being trained in or your education is really helping you build some mastery over your passion or what you're interested in. You know, keeping healthy physically and your mental health, I think, goes in with that. You know, you think about the mind, body, spirit connection. Those need to be in balance as much as we can. I don't think balance is ever achieved, but we also strive for that for sure. And you know, the way we relate to others, I think when we can talk about these things, it feels like you're not alone, and it feels like someone understands and is going is in the process with you. And so creating a sense of solidarity in the community, you know, having care and compassion for folks, and just respecting the diverse way of folks of being and thinking, I think can really expand some of the thoughts that we have about ourselves or about the situation right now. And finally, community needs. You know, a lot of times when students go to school or college, they want to bring back all that knowledge back to their home, back to their community, make that place a better place to live. And I think we're moving towards more self-sustainability. So folks are, you know, really interconnected with their communities. So when you look at a student, you're not just looking at them, you're also looking at their families, you're also looking at their communities. And I think that's builds perspective in terms of well-being.
And I think also with that, right, that I think the goal is to create educational spaces, learning spaces, right, where people can feel safe and exist. But we also know that that's not the case for everybody, right? We also know that schools are not safe sometimes for undocumented folk. So I think it's important to kind of think about that, because while one may feel safe at one point during the day at a school, perhaps, right? When we walk out into a different community or a different neighborhood, that might not be the case, right? So many of these things are fluid in that way, right? But I think that when we are able to build that within an educational system, right? When we think about the relationship between immigration policy, even DACA, right, and education, right? They're so connected, right? We can start to think about, if we don't create these safe spaces, people cannot learn, right? When we don't have safe spaces where we can feel regulated and be at our homeostasis, right? It's impossible, again, for this part of our brain to be able to think. And even when we think about like the fact that undocumented young people are graduating, right? Like it's just, it speaks volumes to the resilience, but we need more. So that's when, as administrators, as faculty, right, we need to do our work, right? Yes. There too. So
yes, which leads into the next slide.
Of allyship.
Yes, of allyship. You know, as educators, we need to stay informed about what's happening out there. I think a lot of times we hear about, oh, you know, they're taking away TPS, they're taking away U visas for folks. And really, when you speak to an immigration attorney, they're like, well, that's not implemented yet. That's not. And so it's like, okay, so how do we stay up to date? You know, being informed about what's happening, and also collaborating and consulting with folks in the area, and establish a network of allies. I mean, I think sometimes, like, you know something and I don't, I know something you don't, and so then we put the pieces together. I think that's like the dialogue is also a part of liberation psychology, where we can deconstruct what's happening in our environment and like making more sense. Like, oh, okay, like that's what's happening. Okay, so when you talk to a student, you're more aware, and if you bring these things up, a student's going to be like, oh, okay, this person knows about what's happening. Like, I don't have to explain to them what's going on.
There you go. Yeah, you don't have to explain yourself over and over and over again to many different people across the line until you actually finally get to somebody who's either going to say, yes, you can get the resources, or no, you can't get the resources, right? So this is so important, right?
Yeah, totally. And you know, you're an expert in your role. So if you're a teacher, professor in the classroom, bring up that this thing is happening. If your office, like, it could have like a little placard, if you have in like a docu-ally training, like it's on there, or something that says like this is a safe space. Also, like, if students coming to you, they're like kind of like trusting you, right? And if they start to share, like, you don't have to like ask them to share more or get the details about what they're sharing, but just like hear them out and connect them to resources that they might need, even if at the time they might not be ready for them. And I'm thinking about mental health. Sometimes folks are like kind of iffy about going into counseling at first, but even if you provide a referral to the name of a person versus just the institution, I think you'll have a better outcome.
Great. So just, you know, this is obviously this webinar is going to be available to everybody. It's been recorded, so you can look back through the slides. You can certainly email us, and we'll try our best to you know, answer any questions or guide you in the direction that is appropriate based on your question or concern or comment. But these are some really valuable resources, you know, that you can check out. I think a lot of them really provide a lot of concrete ways in which you can engage in self-care and practice self-care. A lot of reminders about the body, spirit, mind, connection, integration of all of them. Some UWD has a mental health toolkit that I think is really powerful. There are some steps, like 7 steps that you can do to like create a safe space, or like 7 steps that you can do to like engage in self-preservation, right? And so I think, you know, we definitely recommend you checking these out. And yeah, maybe we'll take the next, 3 minutes, 2 minutes, to kind of go through some questions. But yeah.
So one question is there a version of this presentation in Spanish? Students in my class would love it. Thank you.
That is a great question, comment, suggestion. I mean, I think that's the goal, right? That we're hoping that in terms of next steps, we can certainly tailor this to maybe a high school population, Spanish, various languages that could be offered. There are many pieces of this presentation that could go in different directions in terms of diving more into process-oriented practices, such as healing circles, and many different ways in which we can engage with these topics and in these sections of the many sections included in the presentation. So I mean, I think that that's also the goal, that we can collaborate and build community through this webinar so that we can further expand this work. The California Psychological Association Immigrant Task Force, you know, there's definitely a lot of hope for that.
Yeah, just in advocating and for you know, mental health in that state level. So yeah, there's a link there. Folks can check it out.
Yeah. Should we do one final question and then wrap up?
Yeah. Are there any books you recommend for educators read that discuss coping mechanisms to deal with varying isms and phobias?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Books. You know, I'm just thinking a lot about scientific literature. I don't know if that's like a book type read, but there's this one book I often reference from. It's called Cultura y Bienestar. It came out from providers in community mental health that have been around for many, many years and providing mental health services to undocumented immigrants a long time ago. So Cultura y Bienestar has several authors. One of them is Ricardo Carrillo and Concepcion Suarez. Yeah, a lot of books. It's the hyper documentation also is a term coined by Aurora Chang, and she has a whole book on the mental health stigma and undocumented students too. She has a book as well.
Great. Well, with that being said, we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's webinar, Prioritizing Mental Health for Undocumented College Students. We thank you very much for joining in and, you know, kind of just engaging in this discussion with us. Really, again, the hope was just to kind of think through some of the things that I think we all, you know, we're thinking about every day in hopes to bring in mental health into this conversation. So the webinar will be available to you all, so you can look at it. Feel free to email both of us if any questions, concerns, comments, feedback come up. The email's right here, and we'll do our best to respond as quickly as possible and as correctly as possible. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you so much for joining our webinar. We really appreciate the conversation. Hopefully it's ongoing conversation and we can have another one. But yeah, thank you so much.
Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.